Seamless. And today we are going to be talking about Harmor. And using Harmor, we're also going to be talking about sort of how the kind of synthesis that it uses, which is referred to as additive synthesis. Plenty of you, I'm sure, are familiar with subtractive synthesis, which is sort of just like the basic kind of synthesis that's presented on pretty much every synth ever, including this one. But additive, you might think, is just, okay, it's the opposite. So what exactly does that mean? And the easiest way to talk about this is just to kind of show it. Because when I first heard the term and I looked it up, it's like, okay, it just says that you're building your tones out of sine waves, which is the opposite of how you usually have a more complex tone, like a saw wave, and then you take away from it with a filter. So, you know, as a definition, you can go, okay, that makes sense, but it's sort of hard to conceptualize. So the easiest way to show this is to sort of just play a note, and we add additional harmonics, like the first harmonic. If you're unfamiliar with the term harmonic, there's all kinds of math associated with it, with the higher versions of it and that kind of thing. But basically the idea is that it's a tone that is a multiple of the fundamental, the root tone that you're playing. And as we add more harmonics, it builds a saw wave. And this is how Harmor does everything it does. There's a lot of knobs, there's a lot of menus, and there's incredible complication. You can do a whole bunch of stuff with Harmor, which we will only barely scratch the surface of today. But the basic idea is that everything that Harmor does is all about controlling the pitch, phase, and level of all those harmonics, all those individual sine waves, which what we're looking at in the visualizer represents, is that Harmor is playing those individual sine waves to build whatever it is that it's doing. With this in mind, one of the things that I like about Harmor is that it's presented not as just being an additive synthesizer, because we've had additive synthesizers in the past. We've had things like Camel Audio's Alchemy, or even ImageLine's Morphine, a much older synth. But this is presented as an additive subtractive synth. And what that means in this particular context is that it presents to you normal kind of expected subtractive things, but we're able to do them with a kind of additive edge. Like the filter, the basic idea of a filter. If you look at the visualizer, and we kind of just pick a harmonic, like this guy. If we just kind of go across its journey towards making sound, we can kind of see that it's off, and it's on, and it's off, and it's on. And when the filter cuts through it all, it's not really cutting through audio like it would if it were a normal sort of audio device or plugin, like a filter, like an equalizer or whatever. What it's doing is it's essentially just telling each individual harmonic to be on or off at a particular point. And when all the other harmonics are added together, we get a presentation that sort of reminds us of what a filter does. And if we don't do anything to it at all, we can just use it like a regular filter. Let's get some bass in here. You can just do that, but we can, of course, go deeper, because we have control of what the filter's doing at a per harmonic level. Like, there's a bunch of filter options, and that's cool, but if you go to this drop-down, and you go down in the custom shape, we can come in here, we can see that we can actually build our own filter shape. Like if I just do something ridiculous, like this. You can see that it moves around, and it's essentially using that as a map to just kind of tell different harmonics to be on or off, depending on where we put the cutoff. And we also have this width function here, which allows us to change how wide this whole thing is being applied kind of vertically to the harmonics. And as much as that's cool, even if we're using the regular filter, like the regular low pass, there's also kind of the resonance side, like you would expect in a regular filter. Now, actually, I'll just sort of visually explain how normal filters are supposed to work. Resonance on a filter, like a low pass filter, is sort of this big old thing here, this big bump. We kind of see that, like, there's the cutoff position, where it cuts off the frequency, and then there's the resonance, which is like this big peak that sits right on the cutoff. So in additive world, when we're using Harmor, we have the same basic control. We have sort of this resonance that presents itself as a peak at the cutoff. But we're really only doing that to kind of trick us into thinking that it's a subtractive, regular, normal filter, and we have basic every kind of control we want out of like where that peak is. And we could even just self-oscillate to kind of mimic sort of more hardcore analog filters that when you turn up the resonance too high, it actually just becomes an oscillator. We can just do that by just turn on an oscillator, and then it just is there, which is neat. It's very, very neat. And like the regular filter, we also have ability to make a custom resonance shape. And the cool thing about the resonance is that unlike the regular filter shape, we can do a boost and a cut. So we can go louder and we can go softer, versus the regular filter, which is just a cut. So if I do something. Even if you are not really aware of like what the shape you're going to do is actually going to do, if you kind of just mess around with putting on a bunch of different points everywhere, you'll create filters that are basically not really all that possible with normal subtractive stuff. It also has the benefit of being de facto linear phase, because regular filters, when they do their thing, they do it on a process called minimum phase filtering, where what it's doing is it's changing the phase of the frequencies to actually create the cut or the boost or whatever it's going to do. And then, as we'll find out tomorrow, actually, when I talk about Citrus and FM, if you change the phase of something while you're playing it, you change its pitch. So if you've ever had a filter and you whipped it around really fast and you kind of felt like it's changing pitch, it's because it is. And that's a product of the minimum phase idea. And then the linear phase idea tries really hard not to do that. But Harmor doesn't care, because the individual harmonics are really they're not related to what the other harmonics are doing. They're all kind of doing what they're doing when they're doing it themselves, and it only really makes sense when all the harmonics are together in concert, which is pretty cool. So that's sort of the introduction to how additive synthesis is supposed to work. And the idea is that we are planning ahead, sort of, I mean, not specifically, but the plugin is sort of planning ahead with the idea of the sound it's going to make by just putting the frequencies there that are going to do it, as opposed to generating it with the usual subtractive kind of signal chains and that whole deal. With that in mind, we can also do much crazier things that subtractive synthesis can never hope to do. And my personal favorite is how it handles unison. The concept of unison is pretty straightforward. It's the idea that you're playing multiple voices of the same sound to generate like a chorused effect. And so here's like your pretty average supersaw kind of thing. 9 voices of unison, which you have to remember, every voice of Harmor is actually multiple individual sine wave harmonics. So when we're cloning the voice, we're playing more than one voice, we're playing more than one set of harmonics. And the maximum amount of harmonics that Harmor could put out is 516 with all the odds and ends, the oscillator on the filter and the subharmonics and all that stuff. So theoretically, the limit, if I have A and B on plus the 9 voices, that's like 8,000 something harmonics that we're playing at the same time, which is pretty bonkers. The fun thing about the unison is that it is also product of the additive nature. Because, and this is really the coolest thing that I like about Harmor, is that we can change this parameter, like how deep the spread of pitch is per harmonic. And that's this menu here. So this graph, the way that what's representing is that each of these little pillars, kind of sitting here, represents 1 octave's worth of harmonics. And actually a wonderful sort of visualizer for this is this, the timbre window, where this is sort of how the harmonics are distributed. You can see that the first octave only has like 2 harmonics and it has 4 harmonics. Every ensuing octave has twice as many harmonics in it as the octave previous to it, to the point where the last octave of harmonics has half of all the harmonics that are playing in the whole series. So this is sort of what the distribution of harmonics looks like when it's linear, when you're giving space even to each harmonic. But then we have these graphs. You'll see if you use Harmor, there's the graphs are like this or like the other one. And this graph is even towards octaves. And with the harmonic use of pitch, we can do stuff like only have unison on the lower frequencies. So the top frequencies are not being unison at all. Or we could do the exact opposite, where we have lower unison on the lower harmonics. And you can kind of hear it. You hear that doing that little squelchy thing for a second there. And those are the higher harmonics that are phase canceling against each other, which they would do with normal unison, but now because we're changing the pitch depth, the high frequency phase cancellation is cascading against itself, and that creates that particular effect, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when we do it like this, but then of course if you distort it, which you should just do for everything, just distort everything, you get which is sweet as hell. And like when I first started figuring out how to use Harmor, I spent all my time on this window because you can do and get such crazy, ridiculous results out of just not caring. without doing a lot, honestly. And this is honestly like for like Reese basses, this is kind of like the holy grail of your pretty typical Reese, because old school Reese processing involved the concept of band splitting, where you would have your signal like doing what you're doing. Like that's your typical kind of resound, and then you chop that up afterwards. And you put different effects on it that are pitch-based, like choruses, flangers, phasers, and then you put all that together with distortion, and you get what we just did. But because we can have this unison, and then we can change the unison like per harmonic in terms of its pitch, we have essentially solved for n for frequency splitting, and we don't have to stick to like only this section is up here and that section, whatever. We can do what we just did, and we can do curves, which like you can't do that with subtractive synthesis. Unless you want to spend years doing it. Which is just so much fun. So other pretty kick-ass features about the unison actually has to do with the distribution of the idea of frequency and the idea of notes. Let's actually go back to that EQ for a second, because it has a pretty reasonable sort of look at this. You can see that, right? Yeah, that's pretty good. So up here we have the octave distribution, which you can see is even. So this says C1, C2, C3. And then down here you have the actual frequency value. And so you can see here the space between 50 hertz and 100 hertz equals the same space up here between 5,000 hertz and 10,000 hertz. So like the density of frequency is not the same as sort of when it's ordered for octaves. And actually in Harmor, you can see all these like octave hertz switches and everything, and that's what that is doing. In the visualizer, that's ordered for octaves, and here's ordered for hertz, where they're just even. Now this is important for unison, because if you're taking a pitch of something, you change it like a step, right? You go up a step. And in a bass sound, that might have been like 2 hertz on the lowest frequencies, but then way up top, that might have been like 200 hertz. And so that means that if we're doing individual sine waves like this, the Harmor has to take that into consideration. It has to actually move the unison on that 2 hertz and then the 100 hertz to keep it in like the correct range for it to be a note. Unless, of course, we tell it not to do that by going into unison and engaging the hertz mode, where now it's moving at that 2 hertz at the bottom and then also what it's doing at top. It's the same motion, which, of course, is very different from what you would expect out of typical unison, even when I don't have distortion on. Has that kind of phasey fuzzy feel because it's no longer harmonically in sync. And you can do some pretty crazy stuff with that. Just from the nature of the idea that we're doing a kind of unison that, again, you just straight up can't do with subtractive synthesis. The unison, I could talk for like 3 years about the unison, so let's move on from there before I fall into a black hole of just sweet-ass sound design. The pitch control is actually really important about Harmor, because the stuff that we do with the volume control, like the filters, can kind of be approximated with a lot of work with subtractive stuff, but like the pitch control is really where it gets sold. The biggest example of that is the prism knob, which sort of on the face feels like it doesn't really do something so super great, because it's intensely like obvious when you do it. If we think about particular instrument types, and this actually becomes super valuable. So for example, if I wanted to make a bell, which I always thought was kind of lame when you look at how older additive synths were portrayed as being like, oh, you can make really organic and like natural sounding sounds, which those words mean nothing. And it hurts my soul every time I hear them. But I'm going to say anyway, you can make really natural, organic sounding things because of the control over pitch that we have. And so like, let's go higher now. And like, actually, even without me doing anything, you can kind of hear it has a kind of metallic edge to it. And this is as a result of inharmonic tones. These are tones that are no longer rigidly locked to the harmonic series. And as a result, instead of getting like a note out of it, we get like this kind of just mess, which I don't really need to explain because I just played it and you heard it, so I don't really have to tell you what it sounded like. And just very easily, oh my god, a bell. Didn't have to do much. Put some reverb. You know. And we could do even crazier things if we involve the Harmonizer, which I'm going to reorder to be, I'm also going to turn ramping down so it's sharper, but I'm going to reorder it to be after the Pluck. which is what I did here. And now it sounds even more kind of like the bell. And this is a wonderful segue into what the heck does the Harmonizer do, because it is quite unintuitive, but pretty sweet. Let's default this so I can go back to normal sounds for a second. So if I just turn on the Harmonizer, you can kind of see it does sort of what you'd expect it to do. It creates the idea that like if I play a note, I'm playing more than just that note. Now, there are plugins and things out there that do sort of actual harmonization where you play a note and then it plays notes that are in harmony, but the Harmor isn't actually playing more notes. What it's doing is that it's taking sort of like the lower edge of how many harmonics you have and the low frequency range, and determined by this knob. This knob is telling you sort of how wide it is from only the lowest notes to the higher harmonics. And then it's kind of just copying them and pasting them higher and higher, and those harmonics get louder. So there's still the same harmonics, it's still the same harmonic series, but the particular harmonics are being accentuated to give it the appearance of playing a particular kind of harmony. And the default mode is just playing octaves, but this matrix here allows you to choose kind of how you want that to work. And you can get a lot of results out of that, and you can also just straight up randomize it. There's a randomizing option here, and it does the job like that. Now, why this was super great for doing the bell thing is that the Harmonizer copies the behavior of whatever you were doing. So like right now I have the Harmonizer where it was before, pretty much like before everything. And so like if I did something like put a bandpass filter on it, it behaves more or less like you'd expect it to. But if I take the Harmonizer and put it after the filter, it's now copying the harmonic behavior of the filter and pasting that higher, which is creating absolute ridiculousness, pretty much straight up. And of course, if you screw with that, we can do some pretty neat stuff with the randomizing function as well. Given how much modern sound design seems to like metallic sounds, this is one very easy way to do that. Even though we're actually still, like I said before, the harmonic quality comes from the inharmonic nature of the tones, we're actually still in the same series. It's not actually being changed by the prism in this particular moment. However, the reason why this still sounds metallic is because the divisions of the harmonic series, as it gets out of like, you know, the first 8 harmonics, start to be divisions of notes that are not like actual notes. So when they're accentuated and made and brought out to be like, you know, we can hear them clearly, they sound like they're inharmonic because they're not part of a scale anymore. And that's a lot of fun. And you can combine that with, you know, what we were doing with the unison up there, and you can get pretty excellent sound design that not a single thing else can do, which is why I usually say tagline-y sounding thing that I believe Harmor is like the future of sound design because of stuff like this. But also it's mostly because additive synthesis, while the kind of synthesis that it is, it's ingrained in just the physics of sound. Like the idea of the harmonic series, and that if you have a given sound, like even just my voice, if you have a recording of my voice, that if you look at where the frequencies are, the idea that if you just put sine waves where those frequencies are, because every frequency, every individual frequency is just a sine wave, that you should be able to build that sound perfectly, provided you know everything that's doing. That's purely a digital thing. Like subtractive synthesis, FM synthesis, even wavetable stuff, like was pretty it's pretty old at this point. Like we've done it to death. But additive synthesis is part of like something that can only have been done with not only just with the digital processing, but you know, modern enough power that we can do stuff like lob around 8,000 harmonics and not, you know, tank your computer. But the thing I mentioned about the voices in that brings me to talking about Harmor's resynthesis capabilities, which is something that I have always loved very dearly. Let's use some of the regular vocals.
Don't stay, kick.
Sure.
La, la,
Actually, let's do that one.
la, la,
Boop. Actually, what I should have done is default this because now I'm filtering it.
la, la,
So now if I played middle C, which I'm so far away from,
la, la.
you'll be forgiven for thinking that I'm playing an audio file right now, but I'm not. I'm playing Harmor's sort of frequency map of what's happening, which is recreating pretty perfectly the actual audio file, which means we have unprecedented control over what's happening.
La,
which is one of the cooler things that Harmor can do. And in fact, was the first thing that I kind of fell in love with when I was using Harmor, was that I would resample basses in here. Just do any of that stuff we were just doing with Harmor before. Take that sound, put that in there, and now you have control over it that no regular sampler could, hope to dare to do. If you zoom in here, we can see what's happening. So these black lines right here, these little moments in time, is Harmor sampling the frequency information of the sound and recreating that in the harmonic, the series. And every black line is the next sample, and then it kind of crossfades between it. But it's not just crossfading; it's also moving the frequencies, and that's sort of, you saw me messing around with a scale knob. The scale knob. So you see here, these frequencies are unbroken notes here are actually moving around. And then if I turn that off, that kind of just acts like a vocoder, where the information is coming around, and then when it happens to pass through a harmonic, that's when you were able to hear it. It's literally what a vocoder does. This is like having a 516 band vocoder. So if by default, we're getting pretty regular usage out of it. Especially sort of modern vocal chopping and stuff in this, you can do some things with that are sort of beyond typical comprehension, which is what Harmor is all about, confusing everybody forever with your awesome sound design. And then you add all these samples together, we have this huge map, which when we look at it, again, we think it's an audio file because it just sounds like the audio file. So, well, obviously it's the audio file, but it's not. It's playing a synth. We have synthesized it, hence resynthesis. Not resampling, although I called it resampling for years. It's resynthesis. Terminology. Terminology is important. The reason why that's super cool is because before, if you wanted to have like unison in post, right? There were a couple ways you could do it. A couple plugins I sort of do minimal regular unison stuff, or you can just render it and then manually make unison. And there are also some samplers that kind of just do unison as well. But when we had turned it into a synth, we were able to do all that crazy stuff we did before. We could do precisely the same thing. We could break out the bandpass, or even just turn on the harmonizer. I don't have to do anything. Just turn on the harmonizer. And I'm sure someone somewhere can turn that into an epic trap hit, and that'd be the end of that. All right, Pluck. So actually, let's talk about the Pluck knob, because that's another cool application of messing around with the sort of the regular, with the volume was what I was talking about. So the Pluck makes it plucky. But if you go to the drop-down menu, which, by the way, most controls will have a sort of drop-down menu for either the articulation, where you can hook it up to an envelope or something, or an LFO, or like the unison will have sort of the per-band control of it. And the Pluck is one of those that has the per-band control. We can recognize, again, this graph. That is the per-octave approach of approaching what harmonics are being used. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that this sort of thing is actually just the Pluck envelope. Because when you mess around with the tension like that, it kind of behaves like that. But that's so much more. For example, if I did this, it becomes a little bit more obvious. What this line represents is it's saying how much time that particular harmonic has to be a sound. And then it decays. So like up here, we're giving these frequencies more time to decay. And then down here, it's decaying really, really fast. And we see that. We see that these harmonics decayed really fast, and these harmonics decay not so fast. And so same thing with a bass note, that's kind of just sticking around. So you can make pretty complicated, again, just that kind of stuff. And that's how the Pluck does what it does. And it does even cooler things because it also involves itself with how the blur works. And the blur is essentially adding like a little release parameter to every individual harmonic up here. And if we turn the blur on there, and then like I do a filter, you can see now it's kind of like reverb, but only for those harmonics and only for how long we tell it to be. So we have like stupendous control over like just the domain of time, which is all we ever want in life, right? We want to be time travelers. And that's sort of what this lets us do. I could throw in a neat one of these by turning on the wave line type. How kick-ass are those subwoofers, right? Damn. Oh, I never get tired of that. So the Pluck would involve with the blur lets us do that kind of stuff. So while I was up here with the blur, you might have noticed the sort of the saw and the square thing going on, and why the two of those and why not anything else kind of thing. Well, actually, you can have pretty much anything else. Much like Synthesis, actually, if you just drop a waveform, a single cycle waveform, in there, it'll resynthesize it perfectly to be that single cycle waveform. You can drop whatever you want there. Like you can drop a voice in there, and it'll try its hardest to turn that into a single cycle, which sometimes has cool results, and other times might damage your hearing. But there's actually a pretty good reason why it's square and saw. Square, saw. So let's look at the difference between a saw wave and a square wave, actually. Saw wave. Square wave. Harmonically, there's something very important happening. In the saw wave, we have the whole series, the whole regular series of the harmonics. And in the square wave, we have every other harmonic. In fact, it's all the odd-numbered harmonics. So 2 and 4 and 6 are gone. It's just 1, 3, and 5, that kind of thing. And that's the difference between a saw and a square. But like beyond just Harmor, most content is that. Like if you were to look at an analysis of the frequencies of what's going on, sound is usually either a saw wave or a square wave. And so when we're doing typical synthesis like this, it's actually really important to have like your bass tone to have those particular frequencies. You can of course screw with it, and you can do what you want. Like to look at the graph that made this, you can see the saw wave just has all the frequencies that are just on, and then the square wave has this wave line type, which is very specifically cutting off every other harmonic. And you can change these graphs. You can have them do what you want. And they'll crossfade between them. It'll be pretty sweet. I, however, like to stick to just being the saw and a square because that's pretty much the source of most sound design. At least when I looked at it, and the analysis that I do with Edison or just even the EQ, and that tends to work out pretty good. So at this point, I will open the floor up for questions.
The vocal cut that the sample that you added to Harmor, are you able to make it like the part so that when you change of pitch, like of chord with that sample, the sample will be the same length?
The answer is yes. Like if I just took that same sample. That's what that sounds like, way down there. So then if I put it like, so yeah, every note will have that same speed and that same position for that position all the time. Like it's not like an audio file where in order to play the pitch higher, you have to actually play it faster, because we're just actually playing individual sine waves, which are just going to go how fast they're going no matter what. So like, it's going to be the same speed on every note, unless you set it up to be faster per note, which you can do as well. Any other questions?
So Seamless, you said that you analyze sounds and that mostly they consist of like the base of a square and a saw wave. How do you go about analyzing a sound by then? So if I wanted to recreate something, how I can do it at home? Sure.
So sometimes it's a bit more complicated, but usually what I'll do is I'll open up the EQ, because the EQ has spectral analysis. And if you look at what's happening like, while I'm doing it, and I'm just going to mute it while it's happening so I can talk, the space between these two harmonics here fits the space between these two octaves. And so when the first harmonic and the second harmonic are an octave apart, that's a saw wave series. And then if they're an octave and a fifth, which actually I can just sort of weep, you can see how it's sort of accentuating the octave of the fifth now as opposed to just the octave of the next octave, the bass of the octave. That's the difference really between the saw and the square series. And of course, the higher harmonics are going to do what they're doing, but there's whatever you're going to process with your sound design, it's usually so, like, it's going to convolute the higher frequencies so much that you can't really tell spatial-wise what's happening. It's easier to just try to find the fundamental and the first harmonic, and then that's easy enough to identify saw or square. At least that's sort of how I go about it. Any other questions?
You were talking about during the analysis, it cuts it up in all these frequencies, and I'm not sure I heard right. 512 frequencies, or what amount of frequencies is like a fast Fourier transformation, dividing, analyzing all the frequencies that are in there?
Not all of them. The Harmor puts out 516 sine waves total, and it doesn't usually use that many, like in terms of like an individual voice, and not really a total, because again we could put out thousands of them if we use unison, but per individual voice, the maximum that it will put out is 516. Like when I'm doing the thing with that woman's voice there, that's probably like maybe 100 or 200 because it's so high frequency and it cuts off up top, so it's not really putting out that many. But if I'm playing a bass note, that's when the larger harmonic content tends to kind of come forward.
Yeah,
And
I've got an almost ancient Kawai 5000S additive synthesizer, and it's like normally 64 and the option of 128, but the 128, you never hear the difference. So
it's really hard to add additional like octaves worth of harmonics, because remember we said before about how the last octave of harmonics has half as many as all the harmonics that are total. So that means that to add one more octave of harmonics, you have to double your total harmonic output, which like these days is not epically hard, but this particular amount I have to imagine was chosen just to minimize CPU usage, and the idea that if you did play another set, like you said, it probably wasn't really that noticeable between having 64 versus 128. And you can actually, in Harmor, there's a limiter you can put in here to tell it not to play how many harmonics, so you can experiment sort of with that, and it will save you CPU, I guess, if you don't use as many harmonics. Any other questions? Question way over there, in the dark.
So you mentioned that usually most sounds are made out of saw waves and square waves, but how would you go about analyzing a sound that's not a saw or square wave?
Well, there's actually kind of a weird thing about that, because in Harmor you can actually create you can mess around with the series. Like if I played a note, and I use the detune function here, which allows us to kind of squish or open up the harmonics. That kind of thing. Like if I just did this, like that series is way too close to have been, what the saw or the square was. If we look at that lowest tone as actually being the fundamental. The strange thing is actually that when we do look at this, we can kind of think of like that first harmonic as having been like the third or fourth harmonic in the original series, because it actually does match up with the series if you place it higher or lower in the series. So in the other way, like if I multiplied it, like this series that we're presenting here, if I got rid of this lower fundamental, like from here onward, would be almost the saw series, and only as if we like high passed it and not played the lower fundamental. For the most part, the reason why harmonics work the way they do is because if you use anything else, you create phase cancellation. And then the phase cancellation really only allows certain harmonics to come through, because I could actually come over here, we mentioned the whole octave hertz thing, we could actually switch the octave hertz thing at the generation stage, and it'll play like quite incredible noise. And that's when we're ordering the harmonics themselves, not according to the octaves anymore. Now it's just straight up even hertz the whole way up. And it sounds like a certain way that it does. And it's less now about an individual sound. It looks more like what you're trying to play when you play a big old organ chord. And the harmonics that get through, because the phase cancellation will kind of equal to what the original sort of series is. So for the most part, like literally 98% of the time, you're going to find a sound that is the saw series, because the square is the saw series, just without every other harmonic. Who else got questions? Guy got a question right here.
Hey, Seamless. So when you have your la 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 sound, a human voice can actually make intonations, make la la, like make intonation. How would you go about changing the sound, not the vowel necessarily or the pitch, but the intonation of your la 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 sound in Harmor?
So you said not necessarily formants, but that's basically how you would do that anyway. It's a sort of an application of that idea that creates the intonation. It's also like levels and like pitch, because the la la sound was a lower tone and a higher tone pitch-wise, so that obviously changed a lot of that. But there is a neat way that we can mess around with that in Harmor. So on the image page here, so you can see like what's happening here. You can see mostly that's just a higher note that does that, and then the other frequencies that are in there are moving around to kind of approximate sort of like the recording noise. Honestly, that's happening when this sample was originally created. In here though, we do have a format control, but I'm not gonna move that knob. There is a drop-down menu called the image format mutation, where like everything else, we can actually move formats per harmonic, which is pretty ridiculous. And we can do things like only move, not with that line, but only move like the top harmonics. Because usually when you're messing around with formants, you're messing around with all the formants. And so that means that when you move one or two of them up or down, you're moving even also the higher frequencies. But here, I can move the formants that are in the middle and not touch the higher frequencies. So we can still have like the breathiness of her voice be there and not be screwed with, but still mess around with the formants enough that we're still changing them, which is another benefit of the whole per harmonic idea that Harmor purports in everything it does. We got time, I think, for one or two more questions.
I have a question about this image tab where you drag the samples for resynthesis. I noticed that you can also drag actual image files into there. Is that something
Yes.
you use?
Not terribly often, although actually I've done some pretty cool like visual art actually by like putting pictures in there, resynthesizing it, and then messing around with the harmonics and just like screenshotting it as it passes through and gluing it all together, and you get pictures. But you can actually resynthesize actual pictures, and it'll use like the different like color levels and brightness and darkness and to represent harmonics on or off. And like really, if you think about it, if you look at this whole thing, if you actually had that picture that was the right size and the right configuration, that's just that as an image, and you put that in there, it would sound more or less like that if you just drew, you know, the harmonic representation of that person's voice. And you could also do cool editing where like you take that picture and you put it into like paint or something, and you just cut huge holes in it with like an eraser, and then you put it back in there, and then that's like a filter. You filtered it by doing that. And you've created these sort of motions that you might not have been able to, might not have mean you absolutely could not have done, sort of with regular processing. Who wants the last question? He wants the last question. Ladies and gentlemen, Image Lion's Dan wants the last question.
Yes, I didn't exactly get what the prism knob does.
Awesome. So the prism knob straight up just moves the frequencies and pitch. There is, like everything else, a drop-down menu, and this menu gives us this particular graph like by default. However, we don't need to have this, you know, be the thing. If I had it just like this, it's not going to do anything at all. Or I could come in here and say just this area, and so you can see now it's moving just those harmonics in pitch based on what that line is telling it to do. That's positive and negative, so you move it up or you move it down based on the knob's position. I'm not totally sure what the range is, but there is, again, there's the whole, the weighting difference. There's the add mode or multiply mode over here, which lets us go a lot harder. So if you wanted to be a little bit more extreme, you could use that mode, and it'll do that. And the different weighting based on, you know, the relationship between hertz and octave again, because you saw in the original line that was here that like the range it's moving seems pretty even from here to here, from here to here, and that's based on, you know, the octave relationship versus the hertz relationship. And then the other side is more like the hertz relationship where you're just moving it that far, which is a lot more intense. Yay, so we're good.
Giving presentation.
Hi. I'm Seamless. I'm Seamless.